purpose of Hamas, prescribed, in other words, a legal organization in the United Kingdom, has been to go into Israel and murder civilians. That is their purpose. Yes. That is their objective. The purpose of Israel in their self-defense, and included in the numbers that you've read out, is to go after Hamas, those, in British terms, illegal terrorists who have perpetrated this act. So this is a very different operation.
We know 1,000 people died in Hamas's brutal attacks on Israel. The number who've died in airstrikes is up to 950 this morning. Meanwhile, 300,000 Israeli troops at the border, almost certainly poised for an invasion. Keir Starmer told us earlier of his support for Israel's right to defend itself. Let's speak now to the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Do you have any information on the number of British people caught up in the violence in both Israel and in Gaza?
No, I don't have precise numbers on that. We think it might be in the region of 10 or so, but we don't have exact numbers. I can actually just correct one number you gave. There's actually now 1,200 Israelis known to have died in the slaughter from the terrorist attack, and many others, many more who have been injured as well.
Yes, I'm just looking at the figures. So 1,200 Israelis and 900 Palestinians killed. There are many other people that have been wounded. You know, these numbers are huge. We were talking earlier about obviously what is going to happen next. Our correspondent in the region, Richard Spencer, says that a ground invasion is inevitable. It's just a question of when, really. And I know that you, Keir Starmer, pretty much every politician says that Israel has a right to defend itself. But do there have to be some parameters within that?
Well, every country has to act within international law. That is absolutely right. But I think there is no equivalence. And when I hear those numbers read out, it just reminds me that what Hamas has done is gone in and butchered people. We hear murdered babies, festival goers for sure, elderly people, children hiding in cupboards and then still being murdered, and even reports of beheadings. Their purpose has been to go after civilians as their objective, not to go after soldiers, to go after civilians. They're not freedom fighters or militants. They are terrorists, pure and simple. Now, we support Israel's right to defend itself, but they will be defending themselves by going after those terrorists, by going after Hamas, and wherever possible, avoiding civilian damage. And that is a very important distinction that makes this being the case, that there isn't a simple equivalence between the two sides, which is something which I think is very important to say.
I do understand what you mean. And, you know, we have spoken pretty much every day on this programme to Israeli families who are caught up in this. Some of their children have disappeared. They don't know where they are. We're going to play an interview with the parents of a young man who went to that music festival, and they don't know where he is, and they're sleeping in his clothes. They're sleeping in his room because they're so devastated by what has happened. And I understand what you're saying about the equivalence. However, that the fact remains that the people who were murdered in Israel were murdered in horrendous circumstances, and the people who are losing their lives in Gaza have no option but to stand there or to hide there, and then they are also being killed because there isn't really anywhere for them to go. And I wonder whether it's possible to express sympathy for both people.
Yes, again, I just want to be clear about this, because I think that there does seem to be some confusion in some people's minds. The purpose of Hamas, prescribed, in other words, a legal organization in the United Kingdom, has been to go into Israel and murder civilians. That is their purpose. Yes. That is their objective. The purpose of Israel in their self-defense, and included in the numbers that you've read out, is to go after Hamas, those in British terms, illegal terrorists who have perpetrated this act. So this is a very different operation. In fact, Israel will go out of its way to avoid civilians and avoid that what's often called in these terms collateral damage of injuring civilians. So, for example, before they take down a building, they go for what's called a knock and drop. They'll drop a small device to provide a warning that a larger attack is coming and give people 30 minutes to clear the area. Well, there is certainly none of that consideration as Hamas, and we're hearing reports this morning, went in and butchered babies and murdered children. So, again, I just sort of am very clear about the moral difference between the two when Britain and others say that we support Israelis' right to defend itself.
Do you support Israel cutting off water supplies to Gaza, just before we move off this point?
Yeah, well, I say Israel needs to act within international law, for sure. I've made that point to Israel, to my opposite numbers, of course. It's very early days. They're still in a position where I think 24 hours ago, the border wasn't even sealed at that point. In other words, it was possible for Hamas to continue to infiltrate Israel and carry on their murderous streak. So it is very early days. But yes, of course, we do expect Israel to act within international law. But as I say, their purpose is to go after terrorists, is not to go after civilians. And that makes their operation very different from the horrendous terrorism that we've seen this weekend in Israel.
Now, I want to talk about Ukraine in a second, but just before we leave this entire subject, I'm wondering how this is affecting you personally, and whether you have friends and family out there.
I don't have any family in Israel. I certainly have some friends there. I'm certainly hear from lots of constituents who have friends and families there as well. Obviously, it's a worrying time. Now, the immediate threat with the fence restored has been removed. I hope that will bring some comfort to people in Israel. But of course, for British citizens looking to leave, perhaps 50 or 60,000 British citizens, many of whom won't be looking to leave, many of whom will be dual citizens and consider Israel their permanent home. But for those who are looking to leave, commercial airlines are continuing to fly, though obviously with a very disrupted schedule. But we look forward to providing consular support, and there's a number available and on also the website for those people as well.
All right. In terms of Ukraine, you're announcing more than £100 million in military support for Ukraine today. Are you also actively preparing for a possible Trump administration in America, and what that might mean for Ukraine?
Yes, I went to see President Zelensky in Kyiv in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and he's actually just arrived here in NATO in Brussels this morning. And I said to him when I saw him, they hadn't seen the last of British support for certain. We'll carry on supporting Ukraine until the end. We were there from the beginning, in fact, from before the beginning, and we'll be there right through to the end. It's very important, by the way, that the world's attention isn't distracted by what's happening in the Middle East. Vital and important and supportive as we are there, the war in Europe continues, and we'll be providing assurance, not just with this £100 million, which is part of a package that Britain's organised internationally, but also another 70 million for air defences as well. So our support continues, and we will make sure that happens regardless of what happens elsewhere in the world, including in the US.